Welcome to the Criminal Imagination. This series is not a tale of logic and reason. It is a descent into shadows, secrets, and the crimes that refuse to die. We will uncover the forgotten roots of crime fiction, haunted mansions, unreliable confessions, spectral witnesses, and guilty minds fractured by mirrors and blood. And through this, we will explore how fear, guilt, madness, and supernatural shaped the genre we believed we understood. This is the archive of the repressed. Welcome to the Gothic Evidence Dark Inheritance, a world where justice limps behind secrets, where madness wears a velvet coat, and the blood on the floor tells stories older than law or even time. They told us crime was a matter for the courts. They told us justice belonged to the magistrates, men in robes, men with seals, men with the ancient weight of law at their backs. But what happens when the crime is not theft or murder, but a mind's refusal to submit? Let's talk about madwomen and magistrates. When the supposed criminal is a woman whose thoughts will not fit inside the narrow corridors assigned to her, in the Gothic imagination, that is when the law ceases to be merely legal, it becomes architectural. The cell, the attic, the barred window, the locked chamber, these are not metaphors here. They are the scaffolding of a system designed to contain. The Gothic crime story thrives in such spaces, for it knows that the greatest conspiracy do not always need assassins. They require only a key, a diagnosis, and a silence signed into permanence. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper begins as seemingly domestic retreat for an unnamed narrator ordered to rest after a temporary nervous depression. But the so-called rest cure is already a judgment. It is the legal medical hybrid sentence pronounced by her husband, who is both her spouse and her physician. Here, marriage and medicine fuse into one totalizing magistrate, dispensing orders without appeal. Gilman's narrator is denied not only work but thought. John is a physician, and perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick. The Gothic crime here is not in the yellow wallpaper itself. It is in the quiet certainty with which authority rewrites reality. The narrator's testimony is dismissed before she can utter it. The law is in the husband's pen, the diagnosis in his tone, and the cell is the nursery where the wallpaper hangs. If the rational state prides itself on due process, the Gothic teaches us to look for the moments where process is replaced by prescription. This is a courtroom without witnesses, without counsel, where the verdict, "mad woman," is reached before the hearing begins. The walls close in not because they are haunted by spirits, but because they have been granted legal standing over the body and mind within them. Elizabeth Gaskell's cousin Phillis, on the surface, is a quiet pastoral novella, far from the fevered claustrophobia of Gilman's tale. But the Gothic enters subtly here, through the absence and omission, through the way Phyllis's inner life is encased in silence. She is intelligent, educated, and deeply sensitive, but her desires are contained by the invisible architecture of propriety. Gaskell's restraint is deliberate. It is the silence before the verdict. When Phyllis suffers heartbreak, the language around her shifts to one of invalidism. She becomes a patient in her own home. She was ill but not well, Gaskell writes. It is a liminal diagnosis that, in a different context, might have led to confinement. Phyllis is spared the attic only because she can conform to the stillness expected of her. Her illness is acceptable because it remains decorous. In both tales, the magistrate is not a single figure but a network. Husbands, fathers, doctors, ministers, who act as the silent court of appeal. Their authority is reinforced by architecture, the country parsonage, the nursery, the enclosed garden. These spaces are judicial in their function. They separate the woman from the public sphere. They ensure that any testimony she gives will never reach the docket. The Gothic crime lies in the ease with which the law collapses into the home, the asylum into the bedroom. The domestic becomes an institution, not metaphorically, but functionally, where treatment masks the mechanics of custody. The unreliable narrator in the yellow wallpaper is not unreliable because she lies, but because the conditions of her confinement force her into secrecy. She learns to hide her thoughts in her writing, to work in snatches, in spite of them, her pen a smuggled weapon. The wallpaper becomes both an object and a witness. Gilman's narrator describes it with forensic precision, as if cataloguing evidence in a criminal file. She writes, "It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate, and when you follow the lame's uncertain curves, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles." This is the geometry of madness as seen through the eyes of someone still sane enough to track it. But the magistrates of her world have no interest in such evidence. They prefer the quiet of a compliant patient to the clarity of a resistant one. Gaskell's Phyllis, by contrast, is reliable, but her reliability is her prison. She feels deeply, but her language remains measured. The true Gothic unease comes from what she will not say, what the narrator cannot extract from her. Silence is the perfect legal instrument. It leaves nothing to contest, nothing to appeal. It is the mind consenting to its own erasure. The motive of unreliable narration, then, is not a stylistic choice. It is the documentary form of legal silencing. In Gilman, unreliability is forced madness. In Gaskell, it is forced composure. Both are forms of suppression, serving the same function: to ensure that the magistrates never have to answer the question, what if she is telling the truth? Crime fiction is often imagined as a genre that restores order, but in the Gothic mode, order is the crime. The structure that promised safety, the law, the home, the church, are revealed as the machinery that grinds individuality into sanctioned silence. There is no detective to break the door, no trial to test the evidence. The Gothic courtroom is held in the attic, the drawing room, the locked study. Consider the magistrate in this context, not as a figure of justice, but as a keeper of thresholds. He decides who may speak and who must be spoken for, who is permitted to testify and who is deemed too fragile, too unstable, too feminine to survive the truth. The verdict is not guilty or innocent, it is capable or incapable. Once you are ruled the latter, you vanish into the wallpaper, into the quiet garden, into a letter you never sent. Gilman's narrator at the climax tears at the wallpaper in a frenzy, declaring, I have got out at last, in spite of you and Jane, and I have pulled out most of the paper, so you can't put me back. It is an escape, but only in form. She has left the cell in mind, but not in law. The magistrates have not been deposed. The keys are still in their pockets. The horror lies in knowing that the next woman will find the same pattern on her walls. Phyllis's escape is even more muted. She recovers enough to resume her duties, but the structure remains intact. The parsonage still stands. The gates still close at night. The court of propriety still sits in judgment. Her survival is conditional on compliance. Her life is a probation without a sentence. Gothic crime fiction here reveals its truest archive, the record of verdicts never written, trials never held, evidence dismissed before it could be gathered. These stories are not aberrations from history, they are its footnotes, its sealed transcripts. They remind us that gendered madness was not simply a medical category, it was a legal one, enforced by the same mechanisms that handle theft, debt, and treason. Institutional power in these texts is as much about the gaze as it is about the lock. Surveillance is constant, not through policemen in the street, but through the omnipresent eyes of family, clergy, and community. The Gothic narrator learns to speak in half sentences, in metaphors, in the strange geometries of the yellow wallpaper, because she knows she is always being observed. In Phyllis's case, she learns not to speak at all. Unreliable narration, domestic horror, institutional power, these are not separate motives. They are the three walls of a cell, with the fourth left open only to admit the magistrate. The Gothic understands that crime in such a structure is not defined by statute, but by defiance. To write, to desire, to think beyond the assigned room is to become both the criminal and the witness against oneself. As long as the magistrates, be they husbands, doctors, or actual judges, retain the authority to define madness, the verdict will always precede the evidence. The Gothic crime story remembers what official histories prefer to forget, that justice has often been the mask worn by containment. And so we read the yellow wallpaper not as a domestic curiosity, but as the sworn deposition of a prisoner. We read Cousin Phyllis not as a pastoral romance, but as the transcript of a life spent in conditional liberty. Both belong in the same legal archive of the Gothic, the archive of women ruled mad in order to be ruled. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth these stories offer, that the magistrate's bench and the asylum's locked door are carved from the same wood, that the gentle patterns of pastoral life and the grotesque shapes in the wallpaper are variations of the same design, and that design is always built to be seen from the outside, never from within. So I ask you, when the verdict is written before the trial, when the magistrate lives under the same roof as the accused, when the walls themselves are a part of the sentence, how can there ever be an acquittal? In the Gothic crime story, the key is never lost. It is kept deliberately in the pocket of the one who swears they are keeping you safe. Remember, until next